The following podcast is proudly brought to you by Vite Ramen. Use the link in the description and use offer code BrokenSilicon to get 10% off tasty, healthy, and easy to make ramen. And also use the offer code BrokenSilicon to get 25% off Windows keys and die shrink to get 3% off everything else on the website at cdkeyoffer.com. Now on with the show. Welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and today I am joined by, well, it's actually, I think it's been a while since I've had an anonymous guest on, even one that was almost anonymous. The tech consultant decided to just, he said, I'm late enough in my career, I have nothing to hide. And, but this one took a bit of back and forth to establish exactly how we wanted to do this episode, because I guess what we'll say just right in the beginning here is, your views are your own. They don't represent anything of the greater body you work for. But I probably should just stop and just say, tell us who you are and as much or as little as you can about what you do and who you work for.
Yeah, so I'm an engineer, electrical engineer, and I work for the U.S. federal government. That's about as far as I'm allowed to say.
Mm-hmm.
But what I can tell you more is my background of things I've worked on, maybe not specifically what I do for work currently or what my position is currently. But I think there's definitely a lot there to work with in terms of having a good conversation. And one of the things I told you was it's not so much that I, couldn't get the permission to reveal who I am or what I do, but with that comes with a lot of strings of controlling this whole interview of what questions are being asked and what are the answers.
Getting approval, like literally line by line on what we talk about, which at that point, is it a conversation?
Right. And so I don't think that's fun for anybody. So here we are. It sounds shadowy and cryptic, but it's better for it, honestly.
So what can you tell us about specifically what your background is educationally, professionally, what types of professional work you've done, maybe not the specific work, but like what types of systems and expertise do you have?
Yeah, so I have a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, master's as well, and partially I've completed a PhD program. In undergrad, I focused, I'll start off by saying electrical engineering is a wide field. So, in undergrad, they kind of throw everything at you, and you can kind of decide what you like. You can kind of move more into computer engineering type things. You can move into power systems engineering. It's really wide. Where I kind of leaned into was analog instrumentation, making measurement science basically is kind of the way to think about that. And I worked on some satellite instrumentation at the time. I worked on CubeSat programs. So CubeSat programs are, for those who don't know, they're pretty popular with university. I think they're a lot popular now. I think most people, if you're paying attention to space stuff, you've heard of CubeSat programs. You may have heard of the NASA ELANA program, which is a rideshare program that NASA does where they'll select certain university satellites and launch them up with a payload. But the idea is they're launching up these big, expensive payloads anyway, and it's really expensive. So to make access to space more cheap for universities or smaller companies,
obtainable to actually do this research in that setting.
Yeah, because microgravity and the vacuum of space, or even what's considered, kind of the edge of atmosphere type stuff. If you want to study that stuff, there's plenty of good companies and engineers out there that probably have good ideas, and universities of experiments to do. And it's prohibitive to be able to afford that initial launch vehicle.
And so you've also told me that you've had a lot of experience, or at the very least education, and put a lot of thought into things involving FPGAs, like thinking of rendering and pixels as more of a data compression or, a data transfer problem, and that people keep thinking I think people keep thinking of graphics cards like they're muscle cars, frankly.
Yeah. So if you're from an engineering background, well, I'll just say this. I think the word I threw at you early on was information theory, is the way I think about it. So it's definitely not unique to say, oh, graphics cards and rendering is information theory. Everything digital is information theory. Representing digital circuits as zeros and ones, that's information theory. He kind of had this theory, this communication theory of you have this data you want, there's a transmitter, there's a channel that it goes over, there's noise in that channel, and then there's a receiver at the other end. And that sounds kind of obvious to us now, but rendering is no different. We're working from a model, a computer model, and we're trying to get that to the screen. And so the GPU in this case is making these calculations from this model to decide what pixel to show you, right? At the end of it, it's what color pixel do I show you, right? And how does that relate back to this model?
Which I think half of the work going into, I think what we're talking about literally right now, me and you, is going to be the major battleground for, like, for example, Lovelace versus RDNA 3.
Right.
Like, I think, it's no secret that I'm working on a Lovelace leak right now. In fact, it'll probably be out before this podcast goes live. And a major point I make is that, I think they're both NVIDIA and AMD will be close enough where it's going to come down to almost the non-raw performance, right? Now, part of that is cost, power consumption, amount of VRAM you have. I think that's going to be a major deciding factor for them, and they will both do what they can to give themselves an advantage since they're so close. But I also think that another part of it, obviously for NVIDIA, and I think people underestimate it for AMD, is going to be how efficiently they can turn those teraflops and bandwidth into the correct looking pixel that the gamer wants to see.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting it right on the head. And this is kind of the conversation that, at least going into this, that I wanted to have, was this idea of information theory and utility, essentially.
What I actually want to do then is take a step back and kind of establish, what got you into, when did you really get into PC gaming? I think, me and you have talked a bit now. I think we actually have a ton in common in our gaming history. I think people, whatever this means, like us, have really been PC gaming since forever. But when did you really start, kind of PC gaming here and there? And when did you really become what I would call an enthusiast, where, if this was a decade ago, you were probably reading Tom's Hardware. Now you're probably watching TechTubers. Like, when did you really become one of those people that kind of knows what's coming, the entire lineup, debates with people online, I've thought about this. I've almost wondered too much thought into price performance. Like, if I was paid per hour, how much I think about building my desktop, would it have been more efficient for me to just put less thought and gotten what I almost wonder that. But, like, when did you really become an enthusiast? When was it fun to look into that stuff for you,
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying that there was always a computer available to me growing up. I think you and I are probably about the same age, probably have pretty similar perspectives about how we grew up and the technology around us and things like that. But yeah, when we were growing up, having a computer in the household wasn't a given. It was still expensive for most families. At least I knew growing up when I was in school and said, hey, I have a computer at home. Not all my peers did, but probably the first computer I played games on was actually a Commodore 64. My dad had a Commodore 64, and when I was really young, I remember playing games on it. You could pop Atari 2600 cartridges in it. You could load up those old floppy disks, and we had like Frogger and like those old classic games, and they were definitely old at the time I was I was experiencing them. But that was kind of my first interactions with the computer. Later, we ended up getting a much more contemporary home desktop. It was like a Windows 95 machine.
Mm-hmm.
And that particular machine came with an ATI 3D Rage card in it, or it was embedded on the motherboard. This was a Pentium class desktop, and it came with the game MechWarrior 2, which was kind of the big 3D title at the time. And I was still pretty young, so I didn't really understand, how this computer makes things appear on screen, right? But watching my dad and brother play that game was like, wow, I've never seen anything like this. Like, I had been exposed to video games before. I mean, we had home consoles, NES, SNES, that kind of thing, Sega Genesis. But I'd never seen something 3D like that.
Well, so what was the first, maybe Radeon or even, I guess, like Voodoo versus NVIDIA? Like, when was the first lineup? You just remember the entire lineup? Like, I think that's a good way to kind of ask when you were like a true enthusiast, because for me, I knew half of some lineups, but man, once we got to like the GTX 200 and especially by Fermi, I just knew every card that was on the market.
That's pretty similar to my experience. So moving on from that desktop, I continued playing PC games. I played a ton of StarCraft. That was one of the things I really loved about PC, was there's no shortage of strategy type games. And as we got newer home computers, myself and my dad, we always would buy a new video card and slap it in there, and so that we could play more games on it. So I didn't go and build my first gaming PC from the ground up probably till I was in high school sometime. And I guess this is a good point to mention this. My dad actually works for Intel. And they actually have something called a chip loaner program, where they will give you a chip to use in a home-built PC. They don't give it to you outright. They loan it to you. But as far as I know, they've never asked for any of them back.
I wonder, have you ever, in the comment sections, you always see people go, my uncle works at NVIDIA is the classic joke, like why someone would know something.
Yeah.
You could have claimed your dad works at Intel. Did you ever try to flex on someone arguing with them in a forum by saying that, I wonder?
No.
Yeah, because people who actually have family members that work at these companies don't just say it online usually.
Yeah, pretty much. There wasn't really a lot of insider information there. It's like my dad. He's not an engineer, so he works the manufacturing floor, so the actual lithographic process piece of it. So he's in the clean room working with those machines. At some point he said I outpaced him in my understanding of the stuff, and he's in there building the things, right? So,
well, in the appreciable, like, conversational way, like he's actually helping make them. It's like,
yeah,
I think a lot of people forget, like, especially when I like do some of these leaks where I talk to some sources like Radeon or something, and it's like, well, how don't they know this or this? It's like, they don't need to know any more than the part of even maybe the IP block they're working on in that graphics card, man.
Right.
They don't need to know how the whole thing works. They need to do their job. And in fact, it might make them do their job worse if they know too much.
Right. So, yeah, I built my first computer. I think that was the first time I researched all the parts. I think my dad said, hey, I can get you this chip. Pick the parts around it. So this is my first time looking at, like, this motherboard, this chipset, this cooler, this graphics card. And that was the first time I was probably really, really paying attention to
which generation of graphics cards?
So in that machine, we ended up putting in an ATI X1900 XT.
Okay. That was pretty popular.
Yeah, and that was at the time, that card was the card to get. I remember the feat at the time was you could play Oblivion on it. And,
at 30 frames, right?
And at above 30 frames at 1080p, or approaching those higher resolutions. I think probably back then it was 1600 by 1200.
Yeah, I think it was like there's 1600 by 1200. I think there was 1680 by 1050, if I'm remembering correctly, was a popular one at the time.
So, but yeah, it could play Oblivion, and you could run multi-sample anti-aliasing, and what was then called HDR at the same time.
I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, people forget, back then, now we're talking about 120 hertz, heck, being in some games on consoles. And back then, no, people really were okay with 30 frames per second on average. Really.
Yeah, and honestly, depending on the game, I'll still 30 is okay depending on the game.
That's a heavy emphasis on the depending, though.
Yeah, like 60 is better. I'll not going to argue that 60 is quantitatively a better experience, but I mean there are plenty of games where the experience is fine at 30.
And we're kind of talking about how things have evolved here, and I want to start pushing the conversation directly into this. I feel like there have been paradigm shifts in the way graphics cards have transitioned into new types of rendering. And for a while it was 2D, and then they were like, oh, this one can do 2D and 3D. And then we went into 3D, and 3D I think we almost lost track of how much there is this calculation and utility because things just kept getting better so much faster. And then we just got laser focused on price performance, especially, and I've pointed this out with the PC Perspective crew, and they were on Broken Silicon and other people, that my opinion is price performance got its best when Moore's Law died. Like, if we're being honest, the best prices for graphics cards were during the 28 nanometer era. Are we going to pretend they weren't? That is when, and it's because we weren't able to get as much of a performance increase. And so they felt they had to keep the cost exactly the same if they're just going to make a bigger 28 nanometer card, right? And I think we're starting to shift out of that era again into a new one. Where do you, feel free to bring up anything I just said, but also what do you think we're transitioning to now? Is it ray tracing yet? Is it AI? Or is it just another way you would class this new era we're entering of GPUs? Because I do feel like it is a new era.
Yeah, so I think there are parallels happening in graphics right now of things that have already happened in other types of digital media. And this is where that kind of information theory talk kind of comes from. And so if you look at digital media, let's start with audio, for example. MP3 changed the world. And what MP3 did was it started looking at things a little more mathematically in terms of, I guess the way to put it is the sample rate and bit depth. That's just the data rate. Okay. That's just how fast you can move data. But what information are you actually trying to send? We're capturing a lot of extra information by sampling that high. Human hearing starts to roll off at higher frequencies. There's other things in that recording that you don't want, like noise. So the idea was, could you look at a signal and only extract and encode the things about it that you intend on transferring? And so MP3 is what's called psychoacoustic encoding. It does two things. It looks at the signal in terms of what is its content, what are the features that I want to actually save. So MP3 will analyze the encoder. It'll analyze the audio in a signal to make decisions about what features in that audio do I actually want to spend time encoding.
And that's what, this MP3 encoding is. And you would argue this is just a very similar problem that DLSS and FSR are trying to solve.
Yeah. So from an information theory standpoint, you only want to save data that you can't predict.
Right.
That's one of the fundamental things about communication and compression is if you can predict it, then you don't need to send it. And so that's kind of what MP3 did. It started to look at what parts of audio are important, and let's only save those, and let's encode those in a very frugal kind of economic manner. But let's take it a step further. Let's look at the perception of human hearing. What parts of audio are important to a human being in saying this sounds good or this has the fidelity that I perceive? Turns out there's a lot of stuff you can throw away because we don't even hear it. And so MP3, you go from these huge 700, 800 megabyte CDs for 80 minutes of music to these tiny little files that you can suddenly send over the internet. And that was pretty powerful. We see that now with, those same concepts are used for streaming video. The streaming revolution, Netflix, all that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is made
which
possible.
Is getting better too, but
Yeah.
It wasn't always good, and it was obvious which streaming platforms had more experience. My favorite example that I think everyone can probably start to guess what I'm going to bring up of bad compression is that one Game of Thrones episode in the last season, where I was like, "What is this gray banding in the sky? This is insane, guys! This is supposed to be a premium service." Within a year, everything was better on HBO. They clearly learned their lesson.
That was a comedy of So I like that you bring up that episode because it brings up a lot of good examples of how understanding information versus data is different, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can say, "Oh, I have a 1080p or a 4K stream," but that doesn't tell you about the information or the actual quality of that stream. Right, that's just the output format of it. That's a good example of where compression and information theory and human perception all meet, right?
To kind of I'm going to throw a question here into this conversation to maybe stir the pot. So Zenoan writes in and he says, "Will high-end gamers really even need to use FSR, DLSS, or ray tracing, or should they next gen? Assuming they buy one of the top-end video cards, shouldn't they easily be able to pull off 4K native at 120 hertz with their monitor of choice next gen? Every now and then I find ray tracing to just not be worth it in any scenario due to the little difference it makes to the game's look in most situations versus the performance that we use. And even now, I run 4K 120 with some minor tweaks, and I'm quite happy. Will I even care if I get a 7900 XT?" And I did actually see people making this argument right when RDNA 2 launched, before pricing went entirely out of whack, because it was hard to get RDNA 2, but it was typically cheaper than Ampere cards, and then it clearly wasn't, and then now it kind of is again. But I do remember this month when RDNA 2 and Ampere had just launched, where they're like, well, if a 6800 XT is findable for 800 or less, and a 3080 is over 1,000 half the time, then why would I ever get a 3080 for DLSS? The difference, I already and I touched on that a little bit in my 6800 XT review. I found overclocked even without DLSS. I'm pulling 4K 120 in most games. Do you think this is a fair point about it next gen, or do you think that we will certainly need it, or what?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So I'd say PC as a platform, its biggest selling, or really what's, to me, the greatest part of it is that it's modular, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so a company like AMD, NVIDIA, they're just going to launch their products at the fastest cadence they can to keep that technological, next step moving. That doesn't guarantee that there's going to be utility for that product when it comes out, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's here's a product that, if at its core, converts your electrical power into some kind of computational output. Gamers are going to use that, to play games. Researchers might use that for something else. Miners might use that for something else. But that utility for a gamer of, hey, just because this new big graphics card comes out with heaps and heaps of computational performance, that there's going to be something there for me to use. I don't think that's guaranteed. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of why these graphics cards cost what they do, because in some sense they're a bit of a luxury item.
Mm-hmm.
If you just wanted to play games and enjoy games, there's a lot more cost-effective ways to do it. Consoles, you name it. But I follow your channel and I see the projected numbers for some of these new graphics cards, and
I am confident they're doubling performance roughly. And again, let's say they hit 80%, close enough. I'm confident they're going to be around double performance next gen, and then maybe 50% plus, or even double that again a year and a half after it.
Yeah, so I see that, and I have a hard time wrapping my head around of what would I even do with that much rasterization performance.
Yeah.
Other than surround myself with more expensive stuff to give myself
a reason to.
Yeah. So, oh, maybe I need a new quantum dot OLED high refresh rate monitor or something to complement it, you know? So,
well, you know, it's interesting too. I brought this up to Hardware Unboxed, and well, not really Hardware Unboxed. I brought it up to Hardware Unboxed, and you know, they agreed that with that much performance, there is a fair question to be asked, like, you know, if the mid range costs as much as the high end, but it's 4 times better, like, how many people are going to care? But I saw a lot of people in the comments of that discussion with Steve at Hardware Unboxed talking about how games get harder to run, and it's like I understand games get harder to run, but I do not think games will be 4 times harder to run in 2 years, you know? And I think that it's going to take some time for devs to catch up to using that. And there will be a couple games, but I think 90% of games won't know what to do with the performance.
Right. And so I think this is something you and I can probably relate to in past decades of PC gaming, of just PC hardware being leaps and bounds far ahead of where consoles are. And so developers, they're going to mostly stick around they're going to baseline their graphics performance around the consoles for the most part. And we kind of saw that happen, where they're not going to push too much further out beyond what consoles are doing. And for PC gamers in the past, when we had extra power, we would just reinvest it in resolution and frame rate.
Mm-hmm.
And it made a huge difference, because the acceptable frame rates and resolutions were 720p, 30 FPS, right? So getting to 1080p, 1440p, 60 hertz and above had huge visual return for us. I don't know if that's true now. Like, if compared to, say, a modern PS5 title, let's say Horizon Zero Dawn is a good example. The game that looks really, really good on console. Potentially, you know, comes to PC at some point.
Forbidden West, the newest one.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, Forbidden West. Comes to PC at some point. You have some ridiculous graphics card. Where do you spend those extra CPU cycles? Like, do you try to do 8K? Do you try to go higher frame rate? You know, and at the end, how much is that worth it to you? Because I don't think they're gonna make that title so hard to run that it's just gonna, you know, make Lovelace or RDNA 3 just fall to its knees.
No,
personally, that's my kind of take on it, is that you're just gonna have heaps of extra performance and maybe struggle at where you want to spend it.
Well, you know, I think that when we compare this generation of graphics to a previous one, I think it is that kind of, you know, what would it be, like pre-GCN, too early GCN, you know, kind of Fermi and PS3 360 era, where if you go back, man, the 360 and PS3 were really strong for the price you spent when they came out. And there were people saying PC gaming's dead. And look, I don't know what to tell you guys. There was heavy competition, and Sony and Microsoft went all out with what they could make. And it did kind of make some PC gaming look silly back then, especially with how expensive things like storage were that you needed on a PC and other things like that. But by the end of that gen, you know, and there's a reason it went on so long. So it is different compared to now. But by the end of that gen, I had a 7970 overclocked by 35%. And I mean, it was a joke running games, and the standard was 1080p, and that was considered high resolution still. And you'd have to like look for a resolution that frankly would cost an absurd amount and no one really uses. Like 1600p back then, which is a 16 by 10 1600, like was not standard the way 4K is now. But that's kind of what you'd have to do to really flex the hardware. And I feel like that's probably where we're going to be in a few years.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I can definitely relate to that. I had a GCN graphics card at some point, and it was complete overkill compared to what was out there console-wise. You know, it was kind of the end of that console generation. But yeah, it was like, where did you spend that extra computational power? Was it on resolution? High frame rate monitors weren't really a thing. Me, I would just crank up super sampling or anti-aliasing of some sort just to make the image look as pristine as I could.
QH Freddy writes in and he says, in the last decade or so, there was a very strong focus on anti-aliasing and techniques to basically render better than the screen resolution. Now we suddenly have DLSS, FSR, and soon XE supersampling going the other way, trying to enable rendering below the screen resolution at acceptable quality levels. What gives? What drove this change? Why is MSAA suddenly lost and forgotten? And it does almost feel like it was overnight. Like, just bam, we just stopped talking about it.
Yeah, so I can speak to that a bit. Having watched that change take place, part of it was just real-time rendering changed, and the way the engines operate changed. One of the techniques, and I think you had a guest talk about this on one of the past episodes. A technique came along called deferred lighting that came along that made, you could suddenly render a lot more lighting in a scene, and it made games look really good in a certain way, but it was incompatible with MSAA because the lighting pass would just completely overwrite any extra data you did at MSAA, or you had to be careful at what step of the rendering process that you did MSAA. Here's kind of the crux of it. Real-time rendering is undersampled to begin with. That's just the nature of trying to do graphics in real time. So you're going to do it as cheap as you can get away with. So one sample per pixel is kind of the standard for rasterization. Knowing that you're going to get artifacts from that, aliasing, MSAA was invented to say, hey, we know that edges kind of look bad on models, so let's add more samples there. If you don't have enough samples, you're not going to capture certain features, and that's why we see artifacts and aliasing. And in fact, when you're recording audio or sampling anything else digitally, when you get something like that, we call it artifacts and aliasing. So that's where that term comes from. So in a way, MSAA went away for technological, practical reasons because real-time rendering just kind of changed. But we got some things in its place. We got FXAA, fast approximation anti-aliasing.
Which at first looked pretty terrible, I think.
Which at first looked pretty bad. It kind of made everything blurry. But so this was a filter. All it does is it takes in an image and it tries and looks algorithmically. It tries to find those jaggies. And it doesn't really add samples to fix them. It just kind of smudges them so that visually the viewer goes, oh, okay, it looks, not as messed up anymore. And then we got another technique called SMAA, or subpixel morphological anti-aliasing. It's a mouthful, I know. What that did was it was kind of a mix between FXAA and MSAA, where it knew where aliasing was going to happen along edges. So the graphics card is already holding this information. It knows what pixels are affected, and then it just applies that smudging over them. So it's a better way to do FXAA, but it only works on edges. But really, where it started changing was when NVIDIA really started pushing, and this was probably with, I think, Fermi, TAAA, temporal anti-aliasing. So the idea for temporal anti-aliasing is going back to this information theory thing of you only want to send data, or in our case, generate data, if you can't predict it. Well, TAA says we have this previous frame, and it's really close to this current frame I'm trying to render. So some of the samples from the last frame are still valid for this frame. So why don't we just mathematically combine details from the last frame with this frame, and we get more samples for free? We already did the work. Of course, that comes with some caveats. TAA kind of breaks down in motion. You kind of have to track how things are moving to kind of correct for motion. It's kind of like if you're taking a picture with your camera and your exposure is set too long, it just blurs out. So they kind of correct for that. And I think with TAA is really where people started forgetting MSAA even existed.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a few games, it was kind of up for debate if you wanted to use it or not. But I remember Battlefield 1 being the first game I played where I was like, oh, wow, this just even in 1080p, I can leave this on and the jaggies are mostly gone. And even then, there are some people that complained about the motion a little bit. But for me, I was like, it's worth it, guys. I don't know what you're, compared to turning on some of the other things.
Right. It definitely ends up a little soft compared to a super sampled image. But it's good because it covers everything. It covers the whole scene. And so it's not just model edges, it's textures, it's transparencies. Just by the nature of how it works, it's real effective. And now we see game engines utilizing TAA really, really effectively. They're doing checkerboard rendering. They're consciously deciding where do we add samples, how do we integrate them across frames, and just present you an image that has as much. Let's just being careful about how we generate samples in general, right? It used to be let's just throw more samples at it as much as we can because these GPUs can, but the rendering is getting smarter.
Well, I think once we got everything was just waiting for us to get firmly kind of above 1080p, because once we did, all of these little issues with like TAA and stuff, and they've improved TAA, so it's not like it's just the higher resolution.
Yeah, it's gotten real good.
But also it's more forgiving at a higher resolution too. And I think that what we're seeing right now is kind of this culmination of actually doing what we were trying to do for 2 decades correctly. Like, we just kept getting stronger cards, and so it almost just became easier to just say, I don't know. I mean, heck, I remember with the 7970, half of the games, it was so powerful, I would just turn on super sampling. I'd say literally just render this at 4K and scale it down because it's worth it to me. And I think that all the little methods we were trying just had so many drawbacks that I just kind of leaned towards that. And now we're finally getting to this point where we fully understand what's worth rendering a certain way. And when I really started to realize how silly the resolution debate, as it were, that now I think a lot of people realize is completely ridiculous to even worry about sub-pixel stuff anymore. It's really just how good does it look. Is actually all the way back to the PS4, Xbox One era, I remember reading some fanboy arguments. Like, people were on Xbox were bringing up Rise Son of Rome. PlayStation people were bringing up Killzone Shadowfall. And I remember this debate about what resolution are they actually at. And then I actually read some both Crytek and Gorilla dev talks, and half of all of the frames were at all different types of resolutions. They're like, in the distance, the angles are at this resolution. We actually have a limited ray tracing scene that we're tinkering with in this scene here. That's really, really low level, really, really low levels of it. But if we do it at a super low resolution in this one piece of glass, it looked cool in the cutscene. And nothing we're doing here is at a native resolution anymore, ever, is what Gorilla said. It hasn't been for a decade, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's kind of what I'm getting to is this idea of just in a very linear fashion adding more samples. That's gone.
Mm-hmm.
We're doing it smarter. We're in the MP3 compressed kind of era of choosing what samples we want because they're expensive and putting them where they matter. And kind of at the forefront of all of this is, I think, DLSS kind of throws in an interesting piece to the mix. So,
and you do believe it's at the forefront still, because that's, depending on which crowd you're talking to, they'll say, and I was very critical of DLSS when it first came out. I thought it was a complete joke,
Yeah, the first version of DLSS, the image quality was questionable, but what I like about DLSS is it's very much leaning in favor of that utility of information argument that I keep coming back to, and that is you have this stuff about a scene, you have these rasterization samples, you might be tracking motion vectors and things like that. So build this neural net that can kind of guess what those higher resolution features are, based on training, and put them in there. And if that ends up cheaper than generating true mathematical samples and still looks good, then that's great. That's from a computational standpoint and a perception standpoint, that's probably what we should be doing, is getting there cheaper.
I believe the way it works is they were kind of, before they were inefficiently, I believe, doing per game training, which was insane. And
Yeah,
now
so
they have just one standard algorithm, or like, how would you describe how it works now?
I'd have to look up on how the original version works. I know the old version, they were training against a very super sampled images of the game. So at some point, you do so much super sampling, you just consider it the truth, or the ground truth. So that's what they use for training. So the DLSS algorithm will spit out its output, and then it compares it to the ground truth. And there's some difference between that ground truth image and the image it generated, and then the algorithm over time tries to get that error down. And they did that on a per game basis.
And per resolution per game.
Yeah. So yeah, it got a little complicated, and it sounded expensive to do. It's kind of the downside of some of the neural net stuff is they can produce really good results, but training times can be really intensive and really long. There's actually some work you can look up that NVIDIA just did, taking kind of photographs, feeding them to an AI, and the AI generates the model from it that have gotten really good. So things are already moving in that direction of where can AI pick up the pieces so that we don't have to generate more ground truth samples, because that's expensive.
Right. And now it's just one standard algorithm that you can literally drag and drop into any game's DLSS form.
Yeah, and it's getting better. And, there's as long as you're aware of what kind of errors people pick up on, so that's that human perception piece again. The Game of Thrones problem. Everyone's going to notice a bunch of blocky, poorly quantized information. So if DLSS does produce these visual anomalies, you want to make sure the ones that do occur are the ones that are not going to be noticed. And real-time rendering, I think you have that in your advantage because frames change so quickly. You're not going to look at one frame and just with a magnifying glass go over every single pixel and go, oh, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. Yeah, you're probably not going to notice it in motion. So continually optimizing the way this neural network is able to reconstruct these features, present you an image that you go, yeah, that looks good enough, or at least I don't notice, and do it in a way that I think this is the biggest challenge. I think NVIDIA actually did a good job with Turing, taking a gamble with ray tracing and DLSS, because they knew that they were ahead of AMD in terms of architecture, and they invested that in a gamble. It takes die space to do ray tracing. It takes die space to do DLSS. So that was a gamble for them. They could have easily reinvested that space into just more rasterization performance, and they didn't. So I think that was good foresight of them saying, hey, we're ahead in the market, and people kind of complained that, oh, Turing isn't really that much of a value added over Pascal. And I totally get that.
And we kind of agree with them, even if you like Turing, right?
Yeah, but from my perspective, from a business perspective, that was a good opportunity for them to say, let's try this.
Today's video is brought to you by cdkeyoffer.com. As I put together a new benchmarking station for 2022, I know that whether it's running Windows 10 or Windows 11, I will be getting that key from cdkeyoffer.com. And that's because it's a reliable, long-term sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead that gets you reasonable prices on legitimate keys for these types of products. But it's really not all that they offer. They also can give you keys for Microsoft Office, keys for PlayStation codes, and even some of the latest PC releases like Elden Ring, a game that I'm enjoying quite a bit. Whatever you need, CDKey Offer probably has you covered. And they're always running sales, but make sure you use the best code possible. And that's the ones provided for the Moore's Law is Dead fans. Moore's Law is Dead fans get the biggest discount. And if you go to the link on screen or in the description, you can use code BrokenSilicon to get 25% off Microsoft products and DieShrink to get 3% off everything else on the website. Using these codes really does help Moore's Law is Dead, and it helps you pay reasonable prices for games that you want in keys that, frankly, you just have to use half of the time. So, again, use the link in the description, use Broken Silicon, use DieShrink depending on the products you're getting, and pay reasonable prices for keys today at cdkeyoffer.com.
Do you think that will continue to be a good opportunity, though? And I'm the cart's getting a bit before the horse on this question because we need to see what RDNA 3 actually does. But, as I finish up my Lovelace summarization, it's like I'm kind of seeing a lot of evidence that RDNA 3 may be very close to Lovelace's ray tracing performance. We'll see how bad this ages, but that's kind of what that sounds like to me. If AMD manages to do this with how they're doing it with RDNA 3, which I don't know, maybe they'll just, maybe they will have had to have done something that maybe not waste, but uses a lot of die space specifically for ray tracing purposes. Maybe they're just kind of skinning the cat with die space in a different way, but maybe not. I don't know. Do you expect that, or what do you think? I
expect them to get close. So I know third time's kind of been the charm for AMD, right? Zen 3 kind of knock out of the park. RDNA 3, hopefully also the same thing for them. I think they're definitely gunning to not be seen as, just the budget option or the option you choose if you don't care about ray tracing. I think they're getting a lot of steam from developers from console development since RDNA is in the consoles. So developers are learning how to extract the most they can out of those consoles. To me, which is impressive because the ray tracing hardware in the consoles is kind of meager compared to what NVIDIA is doing on PC. And the results they've produced are pretty good because developers are talented and, they're using it where it counts.
Yeah, and I'm someone who can speak to both. I own an Ampere graphics card and a PlayStation 5. Which has the exclusives that I think are impressing right now on console the most with ray tracing, which is, of course, Spider-Man, and I haven't played Ratchet and Clank, but that's one of them. And I think what you see, though, I will have to say, though, as someone who's played both, I think that Ampere is capable of more obviously impressive ray tracing.
Yeah, agreed.
But if you take performance into perspective, I don't know, actually. Spider-Man's ray tracing is interesting in what it manages to do, but it's not quite as wowzer as you think. But now if you compare it to other things on console, though, like Watch Dogs, it's laughably better than what Watch Dogs ray tracing looks like. So it's hard to say. It's good in its own right. Is what I would say. And I wonder how much of getting RDNA 3 to possibly match Lovelace's ray tracing is enhancing what they've already done and just having the buy-in from developers to optimize it, and how much of it is, no, we're actually putting effort into it in this architecture. Like, I wonder what you would think, how much that balance is going to be for RDNA 3's ray tracing performance.
I would think definitely there's going to be architectural improvements hardware-wise.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, you have to, right? As engineers, you're going to want to tweak and iterate and make that better, especially if that ends up in a place that's going to end up saving you some die space for the amount of performance you're targeting for that architecture. But one comparison I would probably make is, remember when tessellation was new?
Yeah.
And every review would review the tessellation performance. And every time there's a new architecture, how much did they improve tessellation? It's still around. We don't hear about it anymore.
No, because it's very easy now.
Right. I think that's what's going to happen to ray tracing. I think we're going to hear about it every architecture until at some point we stop, because it's just so ubiquitous and the rendering techniques are well established, and you can apply it to every game. And from a perception standpoint, it's not worth quantifying anymore in terms of the results. I think we'll get to that point eventually. I don't know how many architectures it's going to take. I kind of feel like this next round of graphics cards is going to really be the one that starts to feel like selecting the ray tracing option in your game isn't as much of a compromise as you thought it was going to be. And that kind of makes sense.
Well, I mean, I think we're going to roughly double performance next gen in rasterization, which I think, and this is something me and Dan talked about on the last Broken Silicon as well, like once you hit double what we have now, I almost do wonder, like, who cares? Like, that's where, and I'm already happy with a 3070, and that's not even the top card. Like, so you're telling me we're going to have something 3 to 4 times stronger than what I have? I can't imagine really caring unless, again, we'll see how if this ages badly. Some game comes out that's worth it, but I'm skeptical any game will come out with appreciable graphics worth using that much more teraflops just for that. But I think ray tracing is going to be for NVIDIA probably somewhere around 2.2 to 2.4, 2.5, maybe 2.5, 2.6 times what's an ampere. And the reason is it's a higher ray tracing increase than rasterization. So if you double raster, then you're probably going to get to almost 2.5 times the ray tracing. Then AMD, it almost sounds like it's more like triple the ray tracing, but they're kind of behind NVIDIA. So I don't know. It depends.
They're playing a little catch up.
But it depends on the game, of course, because actually in some of them they're not, I guess. But at the end of the day, though, do you think that'll be enough that we don't care yet? Like just triple what we have now, like all of a sudden. I think it depends on the game.
I think it'll always depend on the game. I mean, hardware is one piece, but the software is definitely a very important part of the battle. And I'm always fascinated by what these software engineers and game engine designers are able to squeeze out of these systems.
Do you think we'll do full ray tracing? That's it anytime soon, though?
That I don't know, and so that's where I wonder where some of these AI techniques come in, because one of the biggest things is with ray tracing, it's you just keep adding rays to the scene, and it looks really noisy, and you keep adding rays, and eventually it converges on the image that you want. And it takes a long time. It's very computationally expensive, so you always need a denoiser of some sort. So one of the big thrusts I know right now in rendering is what's the minimum number of rays you can get away with and just have a neural net touch up the results so that it looks, or even have a neural net fake the lighting. That's one of the interesting things you can do about neural nets. Like you can teach them physics. You can teach a neural net gravity. You can teach, you can give them you're not handing them over the equations of wave mechanics and saying here come up with something. You can just train them with scenes, like here's how a scene reacts to lighting, and what we're seeing is that these neural nets can fake a certain level of fidelity really cheaply. So I'm wondering
how much latency is involved though if you were to try to do that live in a game.
So that's kind of where I'm unsure of. I know NVIDIA is really pushing hard in this area of where can you apply it in real time and where does it make sense. A lot of what I've seen, they're pushing neural nets to go the opposite way, go from a photograph to graphics, as opposed to going from a model to an output image. Or at least that's what I've been paying attention to.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the other part of it is the real-time aspect of how fast can you do that? How big of a neural net do you need executed to do that? How much die space is that going to take? What's the trade-off compared to rendering this traditionally and just adding the samples? So there's a very interesting cross-section of AI, ray tracing, rasterization, and squeezing all of those for kind of the low-hanging fruit of each to try and get the biggest yield out of all three, right? And get something to screen.
Yeah, and I can't help but think that it's going to be, though, a cross-section for a while, because pre-baked lighting looks really good, though. And it looks so much more high resolution and precise than at least the ray tracing we have now.
Yeah, and I even imagine AI-assisted tools where, if you've seen how they do pre-baked lighting now, where an artist kind of goes and places the lights manually, is there an AI system that learns what an artist does in a scene and can automate the placement of those things for you? So what part of the problem do you want to attack with this, with AI helping, right? You could have AI helping the rendering, you'd have AI helping the artistic aspect of it.
That's such a fascinating idea that I haven't heard anyone bring up, is like we're focusing on ray tracing. So, as Jensen Wang said, it just works. So you don't need to touch up every little thing. But then could we not also just have an AI help you touch up everything for you?
Yeah, or imagine a tool, you're sitting there the artist is working on a scene. Maybe it employs ray tracing and then decides where these kind of static lights go,
right,
based on what the ray tracing result was, so that the artist doesn't have to go and think about it.
Which would take some work ahead of time making the game, but not what you'd take now. You just probably run some. You probably have some, what is it, like some tool within a game engine, and you have this scene, and then the AI uses ray tracing at 20 frames, and then an AI pre-bakes all of it, and it's like, yeah, done anyways.
Yeah, exactly. So I think all of that is being explored now.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's exciting because we were stagnant for a long time in kind of hardware and software, and this is cool. This is really cool.
I've had this, I don't know if it's a hot take, I don't know if you call it a devil's advocate argument, but just an idea I've thrown out there a few times this year of just, guys, I think there might be a chance ray tracing is going to go from being a hallmark of an enthusiast game to an indie game. Like, indie devs are the ones that are fully ray traced and run at lower resolutions. But then the AAA games are always going to be a cross section of some kind of pre-baking because they can afford to do it. And it kind of always does look better in the places where you can't notice it's pre-baked.
Yeah. So, I think that's a good observation. I almost always look at new tools in terms of what's the utility they offer, whether that's for computing stuff, that's almost like from an information theory perspective, and energy efficiency, right? Those are kind of the two things you need to look at. And as long as they offer some kind of utility somewhere, making someone's job easier, it's probably a good product, right? It's not snake oil, it's not just NVIDIA saying, hey, there's this new DLSS thing and we're pushing it. It's good because we're marketing it heavily, right? If there's real utility there, it will live on, whether it's DLSS or XESS or whatever comes out of it. So, but where you almost always see new technologies adopted the most are like the extreme ends of the spectrums.
Mm-hmm.
It's where companies have tons of money to throw at it and where people don't have a lot of money to throw at it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of interesting, right? So
it's always the people who don't have the money, so they need it, or the people who have the money so they can use it first.
But yeah, I think you're totally right. I think you're going to see some mix of things going on. AAA titles pushing ray tracing and kind of some pre-baked stuff, artist touch a little more. And then you're going to see indie titles. Maybe they're not pushing the edge in some areas, but hey, they can implement ray tracing really cheaply, and you have really convincing visuals at no added development cost for them.
It's interesting too. I almost think that before we know where we're going to go with GPU architectures that try to move past this weird bolted on ray tracing with raster at the same time, we kind of just need to max out both and then converge. Like, I almost wonder if, like, think about what I'm saying here. So let's say RDNA 3 doubles performance, triples ray tracing. Then RDNA 4, I don't know, 80% more performance, and it's doubles ray tracing again. At that point, I think you got enough ray tracing and raster, and NVIDIA will assumedly be at a similar point. And I wonder if what will happen then is they just kind of almost go, okay, so what do devs do with? Are they going to lean into the ray tracing more, the raster more? Can we start actually not improving ray tracing much, not improving raster much? Because you almost wonder if you need to give them almost too much performance than they need, so that we then find out how the rendering pipeline evolves, so that we get to this truly, truly next gen, built from the ground up, not having to support these old games that much. Even then, you're probably going to want to have some things in there so you can run old games at an okay frame rate. But I almost wonder if we have to wait for devs to show us what they're going to do with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that happened in the 90s, right? A lot of the GPU vendors, even with the consoles, no one was really sure how to do 3D. It definitely didn't look like the paradigm we have now, where you send most of it to the GPU, and the GPU handles the triangles and the models and textures and everything. If you look at some of the early 3D consoles, it was like, well, do we do our vector calculations over here on the CPU? Do we pass them over to that DSP processor? Like, people were just experimenting. No one knew what the best approach was until a certain approach caught traction, and everyone went, yeah, this kind of makes sense. This is easy to develop for. The hardware exists, and then it took momentum. And then you also have to develop the standards and the APIs to support it, right? So OpenGL and DirectX had to become widely supported for that 3D paradigm to get there. I mean, we saw that with ray tracing early on. NVIDIA kind of pushed their RTX, and it was kind of like pseudo-supported through DirectX. And now DirectX supports ray tracing a lot more formally.
And now we're,
and a lot more agnostically.
Now we have DirectX 12 actually being used. Like, what was that, a decade ago we were starting to talk about it or something silly? Yeah. But let me move forward here. Mars Lazarus writes in, he says, hello, Tom and Matt. Are there any news? Is there any news regarding FSR 2.0 and or XE super sampling? How do you expect them to stack up against DLSS 2.0 or 2. Whatever? He says 2.x or whatever they call it, whether it's 3.0 or whatever. And do you think one of them will become the standard by virtue of being open source and vendor agnostic? So I think we'll just have to wait to see what Intel does. We don't really know how well it will pan out. It looks impressive in the videos they show, but I don't know. For FSR, though, we've mostly been talking about DLSS. Like, do you have any thoughts on how FSR works and where AMD can go with FSR 2.0 to make? Because I think that's the wild card. We talk about how I talk about in my Lovelace leak that I think it's very obvious as long as NVIDIA is within 20% of the performance of top RDNA 3, they can then just try to leverage a new version of DLSS and really spend the money to put it into every single game on PC and say, whatever, we're better with DLSS and it works now. Like, I think the wild card is if FSR is every bit as good as that. Like, what do you think about FSR and where do you think it might go to maybe make it so they really do keep an advantage over Lovelace?
So to me, the biggest distinction between DLSS and FSR is that DLSS will add information to a frame. The neural net decides, these certain higher resolution features need to be here. That'll kind of insert them with some error, but it inserts new information to the scene. FSR does not, in its current form at least. And FSR is kind of, there's information about this scene and it's at the wrong resolution, and it's more about how do you present it in a way that doesn't just make it look worse. Right? It's that whole thing of anytime you have to change your resolution on your monitor to something sub-native, it just looks like crap. Whether it's because the scaling algorithm NVIDIA or AMD uses wasn't that good, or actually it kind of depends. Like, there's a lot of...
It depends on the game, too. Some of them, they look great. Some of them, it's like,
Right. So it depends on the game. Sometimes, I know Windows used to do this. You would set the resolution lower, and you can choose whether the scaler in your monitor does the downscaling or that your GPU does it. A lot of these monitors, the scaler algorithm is it's meant to be cheap and quick. And so it looks bad, and the colors get washed out, and it just looks awful. If you were smart enough to switch it over to GPU scaling, probably had a better experience, but still doesn't look great. But FSR was kind of the area where it said, hey, let's solve that problem. How do we take this lower resolution image where all the samples aren't necessarily lined up to the output resolution you want? How do we kind of interpolate that information and display it in such a way and add sharpening and here and there, and a little bit of an artist's touch to the final output, and give you something that doesn't just look destroyed by the scaling process. To me, I wish we had FSR years ago, and from a technological
It's almost different than DLSS that way, right? Like, it allows you to just not have to lower resolution, but just you run the native and turn on FSR instead of downscaling.
Right. And so to me, yeah, it's kind of a tragedy. I wish we had something like this years and years ago in PC gaming. And from a technological standpoint, being a post-processing type filter, there's no reason we couldn't have. There's no one really paid attention to that problem. So going forward, so that's kind of technologically the big distinction between the two is DLSS adds information, FSR doesn't, but it presents it in a better way. And going forward, I think AMD maybe got itself into a little bit of a marketing pickle, because everyone was expecting FSR, at least initially, to be the DLSS competitor. And I think they also expected it to be the competitor technologically, not just from a utility standpoint. They kind of serve the same purpose from a utility standpoint. You get more performance, and it still looks pretty good. That's kind of the end result.
Which I want to be clear and save us from people in the comments. I know they're not the same thing.
Right.
But and you put it much more eloquently than I have in the past, from a utility standpoint, though, they kind of are. Come on, guys.
Yeah. From the consumer's point of view of just, hey, my game's not running as well as I want it to, and I need to do something to get it to run better and not look as bad, that they serve the same purpose. Technologically, they're quite a bit different. So I think for FSR 2.0 to be competitive, AMD needs some kind of neural net or machine learning system to compete with DLSS on that same technological level. Whether they call that FSR 2.0 or give it some new name, I think that's up to them. I think it might cause some confusion, potentially. Marketing always tends to cause a lot of confusion. So I'm curious. I don't see these image scaling methods going away, whether that's NVIDIA image scaling, FSR. I'm sure Intel will have some version of it, or just use FSR since it's open. But they're all going to start competing on, I think, this machine learning front. And I think AMD is pretty really, they're late to the game on that by a lot.
But you think they have to add some kind of trained component of that algorithm?
I think eventually, yes. Yeah. That's kind of the writing on the wall, and kind of, I guess, our discussion leading up to this point of machine learning methods and rendering and the utility of just getting a picture on screen that the user says, yeah, this is what I want, whether it's has errors in it or not.
Let me ask you this: do you think there's something they can do? Because it's something I've had suggested, or I don't know if it's even been suggested so much as I've kind of assumed it, like that AMD can do to kind of accelerate how efficient FSR is specifically for their architecture. Is there anything you believe they can do in the actual hardware to do that? Or do you believe it's all software and that's why FSR typically runs better on a Radeon card than a Pascal one?
I think you can do it because I mean, from what I understand of it, it just runs on, it's a post-process filter. And so I think it basically just runs on the shaders. And the shaders are just little pieces of the hardware that are programmable by the developer. So that's why it can run on everything.
But if it's built with one type of shaders in mind, it would be more efficient.
Yeah, so if AMD just built a block that took whatever frame buffer, passed it in there, and the logic of this block, its only purpose is to apply scaling, then yeah, you can get it done quickly and cheaply. But it's going to be a die space trade-off. It's the whole trade-off of do you want to do it in programmable logic blocks that might take a little bit longer to do it, take some energy to do it, or do you want to actually set aside die space and fixed function hardware to do it? Is it enough? Like, what is that engineering trade-off to them? Is kind of, I don't know what that block looks like, in terms of what that compromise is, in terms of what they would be willing to trade for it.
Well, and you want it to be perfect before you add that block too, right?
Right, yeah. You want to make sure it works. You'd want to make sure, it accommodates all the different resolutions that you're interested in. But yeah, at some point, it is a trade-off. And that's kind of where engineering and everything is. It's all compromises between solutions.
Don't you think we're getting to the point, though, where we're getting to such outrageous amounts of performance, to gigantic die sizes on super dense nodes, that you'd go, if we can use 10% of the die space to make FSR twice as efficient, so we're getting 50% higher frame rates or something, you'd think it'd be worth it.
Yeah, I would imagine these are all the questions these engineers are thinking about. Some of them might even be thinking of, I guess here's kind of devil's advocate to the point I made of AMD needs a neural net type upscaler, is there's probably an alternate opinion somewhere existing that says, no, let's just keep pushing hard on just rasterization and ray tracing and never trade that die space.
That's kind of what it almost sounds like to me too. I think with like little tweaks here and there so that FSR runs more efficiently, if you can do a little tweak to RDNA 3, but yes, in terms of the overall idea, I kind of think that's what they're leaning towards.
Yeah, so there's that ultimate argument. There's that you imagine a world where it doesn't matter. You have enough gains in rasterization and ray tracing gen over gen that you don't care. Or maybe you have such good gains in rasterization and ray tracing, you just super sample or even subsample using FSR, and it looks good enough. Like it's all different routes to the same end. Of in what manner do you add information, or in what manner do you get to this final render and present to the user. And you get in this complicated space of, do I just oversample? Do I add neural denoising? What are the different things I can get to? And at the end of the day, it's here's a picture at a certain frame rate to the user. And anyone who can make gains in efficiency to that output using any of those means, I think is going to be good, especially if it ends up easy for developers to get to. There's definitely something to be said about, let's just crank up the amount of sampling we can do and just use simple FSR where needed, because that's easy for developers. It's DLSS and those types of techniques take work to integrate into your engines. But just adding more samples and downscaling is really easy. So
yeah, I mean the amount of, and NVIDIA has the money, but the amount of effort that was needed to put in to have DLSS, the fact that comparatively so much less effort could make something like FSR, where we're even having the discussion that they're comparable. You can see the person in AMD and the engineer going, look how much less we're spending to compete.
Yeah. The flip side of that is NVIDIA, they're not just putting tensor cores on their GPUs just for DLSS, right? They know that there's researchers out there doing machine learning research and a lot of workloads that benefit from having tensor cores. So for them, I think it's a little more important because they have that place in the market, whereas AMD doesn't have as cemented of an AI research type hardware pitch.
Well, and that kind of leads perfectly into this other thing I wanted to bring up earlier, but let's get to it now. I think there's NVIDIA, like you brought up, was ahead with Turing. So they knew they could start gambling on features that weren't just strictly really, really for gaming. I mean, even ray tracing wasn't really for gaming when it was first added to Turing. But I think in hindsight, you might argue they may have realized that image quality is getting to such a level that it might be worth focusing on the utility of a GPU, because I've seen every Ampere review focus on like the NVENC encoder and like non-gaming tasks. Chris Rich writes in and he goes, the transistor density of new chip manufacturing processes is still improving, but the cost per wafer is now increasing about as fast as it seems. And just to make it specific, like I know that the wafer cost for TSMC's 5 nanometer is about 70% higher per wafer compared to 7 nanometer. So 5 nanometers, 70% more for the same wafer compared to 7. And that means that even if you get 80% more density, you're practically just paying 1-to-1 for it. But he continues, in other words, the cost per transistor is only improving very slowly or perhaps not at all. Do you agree, and do you think end customers will need to adjust their expectations for new products? Would you expect the manufacturing side to change to mitigate this? And again, I think this is an important point, because I think they're realizing, I mean, if we can convince everyone they're, actually a pessimistic way would be to put it, if we can just convince everyone they're a creator, maybe they'll pay extra for the gaming card anyways. I do think that's a fair point, because it happened when Vega came out. I remember seeing a lot of fair points from NVIDIA fanboys in the WCCF Tech comments going, I didn't realize all AMD gamers were creators now.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point. In order for us to keep making gains of computational density, the process gets a lot more complex. That happens in every industry. In industry, it's the 80-20 rule, right?
Mm-hmm.
The last 20% of anything takes 80% of the energy and effort, and that's kind of the wall we've been slamming into with Moore's law for a while now. Is, hey, we can't just cut the feature size in half every year and have a new GPU generation every year, and everything just doubles and it's magical. We had that time period of technology, and it was both wonderful and bad, right? Because
the software was terrible
performance every year, but your stuff was obsolete in a year.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a little bit of benefit to stagnation, and I think you mentioned that a little bit about the 28 nanometer era of things were stable in terms of, as a commodity, how much computational power you needed, how accessible it was, how cheap it was, and you weren't really expecting things to move and leave you obsolete. So with graphics cards getting more and more expensive, it makes you wonder, are we going to settle on a level of performance that we say, yeah, it's good enough, and people who need more are just simply going to be the people willing to pay a lot more?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the ultimate player in this whole utility argument is ultimately be, what does Nintendo do with Switch 2 hardware? The whole rumor was it's going to be DLSS at the forefront. It's going to be some kind of chip that can do DLSS, and that's how they're going to reach their 4K target. At least that's the rumor. I don't know if you've heard more than that.
Well, I had that Switch 2 leak where I kind of talked about how the level of performance I expect, and of course, I just laugh when people ask me how much stronger will it be than the original Switch. It's like, it's so weak. How do I even quantify how much stronger it is? Like, it's gonna be like at least 10, 100. It's gonna be crazy stronger. I mean, we're talking about a 20 nanometer chip compared to what will be probably a 5 or 8 nanometer chip or something.
Yeah, and so I think the Switch is a good study point for this utility argument, because computationally it's nothing special.
Mm-hmm.
But it sells like hotcakes, and people like playing games on it. And I think Nintendo currently they don't want to just sell you a computer that plays games.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's their business model. I think at least with every console they've released, they try and do something special with it. So like the Wii was motion controls, and the DS had touch screens, and everything they release has some other aspect to it of how they're trying to entertain and engage with you. It's not just, it's got more power.
Mm-hmm.
So the manner at which the Switch 2, I think, approaches getting more visual fidelity is going to be telling about that utility argument, and telling about the costs associated with reaching that level of fidelity and newer process nodes. My thoughts are Nintendo's going to go with the leanest thing they can get away with. That's kind of been their
and maybe
MO
even one
time.
step below what we would say that is, because they always seem to be just a little weaker than even what I thought the minimum would be.
And if DLSS allows them to get there, that probably means from an energy standpoint and a rendering standpoint, that was the right trade-off to make.
Mm-hmm.
Which kind of cements this idea of this is probably the future of where real-time rendering is going. If Nintendo consciously with NVIDIA make the decision that the best way to get to the level of performance they want is to rely heavily on DLSS, and that allows them to get the chips cheaper and in the quantities that they want, then that's very good economically. And I, as a consumer, would be really interested in seeing what those results look like. Am I going to see a 4K Nintendo game that's just going to blow me away and be like, yeah, this is good, I'll play this?
Well, I'll say,
I want to see where it ends up.
In terms of raw performance, I'm expecting it. I'm trying to think of exactly how would I class this? Probably something. Oh God, I'm just trying to relate it to the other consoles. Probably something that's, plus minus 30%, which I know is a huge range, but there's a lot they can decide on and what die they go with in terms of the Series S. But then if you throw DLSS on top of that, I still have trouble believing it will easily run every game at a fake. Again, is it fake? It's not really fake, but it looks just as good. 4K 60, I think that's kind of where they're looking at. And so I don't know where you would class that, if that's good enough, something around Xbox Series S, but with DLSS.
I think for Nintendo, it's good enough.
I agree,
And Nintendo is pretty smart. If they want to make a game 60 FPS, they adjust the art style to get there, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of and a lot of their games kind of lend to that. They don't go for ultra fidelity. A lot of times it's more cartoonish, that's the art style lends itself to easier rendering, I guess is the way I would put that.
My counter argument to that always, the art style argument is, yes, but Nintendo, if you just made it a little better, you could have every third-party game and make all that money too.
Right. So yeah, I also agree with that as well. They also lock out a bunch of really talented developers because the games simply can't run on their hardware.
If the Switch was, again, and I think I've covered this, like I think they could have gone with Pascal. They could have actually gone with Volta even potentially, but instead they went with Maxwell after Volta was out. I just go, God, if you would have just given it 6 gigabytes RAM instead of 3, and you would have just given it that little 50% performance bump, which probably, if we're being honest, would have cost like $20. Like, you could have run every third-party game that PS4 did.
In some alternate universe, there's a version of Nintendo that doesn't underspec their systems, but
that pays $20 to double performance.
But yeah, that's a good thing. This rising cost, commodity cost for essentially computers. Steam Deck, I think, is also another good product to study there, because it's coming in with a pretty modern APU, and we're still even just looking like, how well is this going to run things even at 720p with FSR? So that's the ballpark we're playing in. I would love to see what the SoC, the Lovelace or whatever SoC Nintendo chooses for Switch 2, where it ends up in comparison to Switch or Steam Deck, and what it costs and just what developers can do with it.
So to bring it back to an earlier thing, I do want to ask this. Guntis Peglis writes, and he says, hello, Tom and Matt. What are your general thoughts on the subject of balancing performance and picture quality in gaming? Right now, we already have checkerboarding, DLSS, NIS, FSR, XE super sampling, and variable rate shading for things like upscaling, sharpening, and spending less shading resources in general on objects that just don't need it. Is there a new technology around the corner that could help selectively render the important parts of the frame in higher fidelity and the less important parts in lower, kind of like rendering in FP16 and then rendering maybe this other part of the frame in FP32?
Yeah, so I think that's right in line with what we've been talking about, of just where we think things are going. I think it would be cool to see futuristic engines and graphics pipelines that are totally aware of the complexity of the model they're trying to render and choose very economically where to sample. I think that would be amazing. Right now, it's just kind of everything gets uniformly sampled, as if it has the same importance to some extent. I mean, you mentioned developers do things where not all parts of the scene are rendered at the same resolution, but I mean even to an even greater degree than that, like to the point of certain pixels get super sampled. But built from the ground up. Like these are all
just from the ground up a pipeline that it's not like we even market what it uses. It's just like it brings all these different things
the whole time.
Yeah. Which I think you see I've seen some kind of like first party console devs play with this. You see, I think Epic playing with this in Unreal Engine 5, like this, almost like where they're like, well, we don't really worry about this. Like our whole pipeline is built to minimize this stuff.
Yeah, Unreal Engine 5 is a good example of that utility and final output and how much information per pixel do you actually need. I think that was kind of their big push with their Unreal 5 engine demos and Nanite, where you can just feed it these monstrous high-resolution assets, and you don't have to think about doing level of detail, scaling, on it. It decides for you based on how far something is, or et cetera. It's gonna scale the fidelity of how it renders something to make it cheaper.
So then, to kind of directly answer his question, you think the next step is just the engine has their own cocktail that does all of this here and there. And then I guess maybe in NVIDIA drivers and AMD's Catalyst, we just have the option to force FSR or some version of DLSS, or, maybe a some other, not, it wouldn't be DLSS if you force it in a game because it kind of needs to be integrated, but like they make a version of it like FSR, and which I think they already are, by the way. And that's just an option in case this game is just kind of lazily put together on an old engine.
Yeah, so there's a lot to be said about what modern engines do for a developer in terms of optimizing those things, so you can focus on just making a game and not focus on how do I push it through the GPU efficiently. But I guess to answer the question more directly is I think we're already there in terms of, is there something around the corner that's going to selectively sample and make more efficient use of sampling? I think we're there. I think we're FSR and DLSS and nanite and all of it, all these new techniques you're hearing about, that's it. It's I think it'll be a while for the dust to settle to kind of figure out what paradigm do we want to settle in terms of this more economical, efficient rendering. But I think we're there, and I'd like to see it pushed even further. As you were saying, at a hardware level, at a driver level, at the fundamentals of rendering. Is there a system that could intelligently make good sampling decisions based on the frame it thinks it has to render? We were kind of doing it now, but I think there's still a lot of... It's
just kind of haphazard, ad hoc, and clumsy. We're not quite to where it's standardized and everything.
Yeah, we're kind of like at dynamic resolution where, the game drops from 4K to 1440p for this frame because it's heavy. But I imagine it even more like in a single frame, the resolution varies.
In different parts of it.
It's like,
foveated rendering.
Yeah, there's like nothing really going on in the sky, so it's sampled really sparsely. But the grass, there's a lot of detail, so we do a lot of sampling there, and just an engine being able to make those decisions in real time on a per frame basis in a way that's not uniformly sampled the way it is now. So I think we're getting to the point where we're already doing those kinds of things, and it's going to continue to get more baked in to the engines themselves and even into the rendering. And that's a cool place to be.
So I want to then move on. We've been talking for a while here. I've got like two more probably main subjects, but one I kind of want to touch on briefly first, or not briefly, depending on how much we have to talk about it, is FPGAs. That was something you said there was a lot you could speak about. And I think I'm just going to open this up to try to get right into it quickly. How do you see FPGAs being used with graphics cards, rendering, gaming moving forward? And this comes from, I remember 5 years ago, everyone was talking about ASICs constantly. We're going to have an ASIC that does this, does that. And this is probably coming from an outsider, less educated on the matter perspective. But now it just seems like people are talking about FPGAs far more than ASICs. Do you know what I mean by that? And how do you think this is going to intersect with gaming hardware?
So I don't have a lot of perspective of, say, people mentioning ASICs more than FPGAs. So I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about...
Well, at Hot Chips, I just remember looking at some older ones, a lot of presentations, and they're still there, right? And ASI, this isn't me saying, we're not... No, we're using them all the time still.
Yeah.
It just seems like most of the headlines are like a new FPGA that does this one thing.
So for those who are listening, if you don't know what an FPGA is, it stands for Field Programmable Gate Array. The easiest way to think about it is these are blank logic blocks. They're not really blank, but there's any digital circuit, you build it out of gates. These logic gates, they do AND gates, OR gates, NOT gates. If you take a digital logic class, that's kind of where you start. And you can build circuits out of these gates. So you want to build a circuit that adds two binary numbers. There's a configuration of gates that you put together, and it performs this function. And you build up these little pieces slowly, piece by piece, until you have a full functioning thing that you want, whatever digital function you want. So an FPGA is kind of this array that has a lot of these gates available. And when you program it, it changes the way they're connected together to achieve the function you want. So you don't, it's not like a CPU where you tell it what to do through programming and it moves your binary bits around to the gates that need to do those functions. The hardware itself actually rewires to do what you want to do. So when you program an FPGA, use something called a hardware descriptor language. It kind of looks like a programming language, but you're not describing what to do to the data. You're describing the hardware you want to exist. It actually, in practice, it ends up being a little bit of a mix of both, because just like in programming where there's a compiler for the hardware descriptor language. And you can tell the hardware descriptor language, like, I want these specific gates. I want 2 AND gates feeding into this OR gate, and the output goes here. So you can be very specific about how you want things wired. Or you can say, I just want this logic to be carried out, and it can figure out which gates to connect to do it for you. So there's a little bit of flexibility in terms of, I know exactly what I want, or just try and solve the easiest thing you can to achieve the result that I want. So where FPGAs are really useful are, one, if you're learning digital design, that's where you're going to start. So if you're designing digital circuits for any purpose, you're probably going to design them on an FPGA, because not only are the gates rewirable, you can rewire the inputs and outputs. So if you need to connect it to other chips, you can connect it to other chips. So let's say Intel or somebody is prototyping a new block that's going to be on a chipset.
Right. This is how they do a lot of their R&D.
Yeah, or doing a chipset or something. Yeah, they can test what the performance and verify that it's going to do what they want to do by testing it on FPGA before committing to building a permanent version of it.
Which is tens of millions of dollars to make a permanent version.
And so there's no difference between like Intel's final chipset and an ASIC. The ASIC is just a taped out version of what you
were testing
prototyped on the FPGA. You just decided that I'm done testing it and I want to build thousands, millions of them now. And so whether you choose an ASIC or an FPGA is really going to depend on what you need from an engineering standpoint. If you're prototyping something that you plan on making millions of, then yeah, you'll probably put an ASIC in every one of those devices at the end of the day. But kind of going back to the space payload stuff, satellite, for example, there's not a lot of missions where you're building more than one satellite for something. There's some There's some exceptions like GPS or certain communication satellites where you're going to build hundreds of these things. Starlink is a good example. Then you want to go for an ASIC. But for a lot of these missions, these satellites are one-offs. So an FPGA is actually a good option because you get exactly the custom digital hardware that you want, and you only need it once. So in that case, the extra cost that an FPGA has per unit over an ASIC is fine. It's actually in your favor.
And so like this FPGA is like this, the companies, there's a lot of companies I've been talking to behind the scenes that specialize in them. This emergence of all these FPGA companies, it's a big deal because it kind of accelerates R&D then, is kind of what you're saying, and what you can do with one-off projects.
Yeah. So they're very useful. Another place they're used a lot is in communication systems. So anytime you need to generate or receive it and analyze it really quickly, so 5G communications, for example, is a good. FPGAs are great. A lot of FPGAs have PCI Express buses on them so that you can quickly transfer data. And for example, for communication systems, latency is a big deal. You don't want to spend a lot of time receiving data into a buffer, moving it to memory, pulling out of memory, having the CPU do its thing, push it back to another buffer, and then get it out the door. You want to do that as quick as possible. So with an FPGA, you can say, hey, pull this data right into the buffer, and then from the buffer, go right into the logic that does exactly what I want to do and nothing else. It has this one function, demodulate or apply this filter or do these computational tasks, do them quickly. It's kind of like that. For example, when we were talking about earlier, the FSR, whether you do it in shader model and do it on the shaders in a programmable fashion, or you build your own block to just do it quick and cheap. FPGAs like building that block where you just do it quick and cheap.
But the actual block will be more of like an ASIC.
Yeah, it would be an ASIC at the end of the day for something like FSR. But I'm just making that comparison of computationally, when you build a digital circuit who has one function, it can do it really quick and it can do it really energy efficiently. Maybe not the most die space efficient, but it does it quick. So in situations like communications where that's what you want low latency and you want to do a lot of mathematical things, in this case modulation, demodulation, really quickly, FPGAs are great.
Yeah.
I am proud to say that Vite Ramen is a sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead. The Vite Ramen Company is an American company that pays its workers fair wages and engineered a tasty, healthy, and cheap meal that you can cook in less than 5 minutes. And these meals just got tastier with their updated version 3 of their ramen recipe. Meals aren't really healthy unless you keep coming back to eat the healthy ones, and that's what they've done with these updates to version 3. Now is the best time to order some Vite Ramen. So if you're busy, hungry, or just looking for a pre-made meal that isn't expensive, get some nudes sent to you. Click the link in the description and use the code BROKENSILICON to save 10% on your order. This helps me, this saves you money, and this supports a good company. Buy Vite Ramen today.
So I'm going to jump in here because I think I have a good time to ask this question. Carbon Cry writes in and he says, given Matt, and he put it in quotes, if that is your real name, given Matt's experience with FPGAs, do you have any thoughts on the Xilinx AMD merger? Competitive positioning of Xilinx versus Altera? I hear Altera focuses on making programming an FPGA easier, while Xilinx seems to have gone the application store route. Is that the correct view in your opinion? And which approach do you feel is more desirable by the market?
So when I first worked on FPGAs, they were Altera. And I think this was prior to Intel acquiring them. And my experience was positive. You know, their programming workflow and tools were really straightforward and easy to use. The latest project that I worked on with an FPGA, it's a Xilinx board. It's hard to comment on actually the quality of Xilinx software because in that particular project, the stuff that's giving me trouble has nothing to do with Xilinx. It has to do with other hardware that I'm working with. So I don't know that I can make a good comment on one approach versus the other. What I will say is I think what you might be referring to is a trend I've seen in other parts of the industry concerning engineering, prototyping hardware and stuff like that, where there are a lot of companies that are leaning into kind of these turnkey solutions. So say you want to do compliance testing for DDR5. A company is going to sell you some suite of hardware that it's not just the hardware that enables that testing. It's going to be software and compliance testing. They already kind of did the work for you so that you can buy that thing, plug it in, and get it going. So I think if I'm interpreting your question right, when you say more of an app store approach, I think that's maybe what you're describing. Feel free to leave a follow-up. I can, but I think both approaches are useful. So it's going to depend on the company you work at and what resources they have, and and what the end product is. So, and what I mean by that is you might be a small company and you're trying to build something revolutionary from the ground up. And so you might just say, hey, it's okay if I have to build all these blocks from the ground up because this is going to be the bedrock of my company, and I want to know it in and out, and it needs to be bespoke and perfect.
Mm-hmm.
You might work for a big company that has lots of capital behind it, and they're like, we need a solution tomorrow. And you go, oh, hey, Xilinx offers this board, and it offers this right connectivity, and it comes with this software package, and it's a one-click buy, and it's here, and we have functionality tomorrow. This, the smaller company may not have the capital to just throw for that kind of turnkey solution to just go. So it's just going to depend. I think both approaches are useful. It's just going to depend. What do you need as an engineer? Do you need it now? Or as a company, you may not have the engineering resources to build something from the ground up. You might be able to afford an FPGA, but if you don't have engineers that have substantial FPGA experience, then it's useful for a company to offer these kind of turnkey solutions of here's the FPGA, but here's some building blocks that go with it so that you can get started right away.
It's interesting. I've talked about AMD's acquisition of Xilinx from the perspective of their hard design team that's apparently world-class at working with TSMC. That's something AMD wasn't as good at, I've heard, before they acquired them. And then I've also, of course, it's like, well, they also offer all these other products that can be bundled with AMD stuff. It appears to me, talking to you now, that also a major benefit of having Xilinx become a part of AMD is their expertise building these FPGAs that are used to do R&D, right?
Yeah, potentially. I don't know what AMD's current prototyping workflows look like.
Yeah.
But it definitely helps, I think, with so much of it being on FPGA and digital design, having that expertise in-house.
Yeah, I just think that's definitely potentially a part of it. And a lot of people ask me, is there any other reason AMD's buying Xilinx? And I think you're kind of touching on a lot of that there. So okay, moving on to the kind of the final IP block of discussion points, if you will, that we are going to go through. Let me see. I just kind of want to ask an open question here. It's something that I try to, I try to only talk about geopolitical things when they're on subject, but I think I have an on-subject question to ask you. Is there going to be a worse time to release a 500-watt graphics card than when gas prices are soaring because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
I think for big companies, it probably doesn't matter. Right. I think what we saw with at least coronavirus and the lockdowns, there was a lot of companies buckled for less business, especially in the tech sector, and ended up getting more. Zoom, Microsoft, everybody was scrambling to just add more cloud infrastructure, just buying up tons and tons and tons of chips. So I think for big tech companies, whatever the price comes out to be, I think they're going to eat that cost no matter what, because if they don't buy it, their competitor will.
Exactly, yeah. But for gamers, though, I guess.
For gamers, yeah, it's kind of this perfect storm. We're already trying to get out of this hump of shortages and logistics problems that have been associated with the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on top of it, we have a war going on that's going to it's going to displace people. It's going to upset the economy. That's the thing about the world we live in today. It's so connected that we're not going to even know what trickles out of this conflict in terms of upsetting the economy, because we always find out we're connected in ways we never really thought of before. So energy, I think, is kind of the obvious one in terms of there's real opportunity cost now of now it costs more to heat my home and buy electricity and do all that stuff. Do I really want to spend an arm and a leg on what's already an expensive GPU just for it to suck up a bunch of power? And that's that utility argument of, one, can you afford it, right? Opportunity cost is different for everybody. If you're really well off, hey, you may not care. But for some people, that's the difference between them being able to afford gas to get to work or heat their home and do that kind of thing. So,
I think in general, people are just underestimating the realignment of how much is going to change when it comes to supply chains and alliances between, or just the geopolitics between different countries, that we're looking at a complete realigning of the relations between dozens of countries right now, and that if we assume it's just, oh well, Ukraine makes a bunch of grain, so food prices are going to go up, gas prices are going to go up. I think there's a lot of hard to predict things, and I think I would remind everyone that, and I talked about this with the OEM in PC OEM engineer that I had on like last year, or was it over a year ago? I don't know. It was a while ago. And we talked about how when the pandemic started, everyone was like, well, people are going to buy less, so we better make less computers. And then just immediately it's like, yeah, except now we're all using the cloud. So what are you doing? And I worry that there's a lot of things going on now with predictions in the markets where I'm like, this is way bigger repercussions than just higher oil prices with Russia. This is definitely going to affect how we work with China too and everyone else.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is going to have ramifications on all parts of our daily lives. Yeah, not just the fuel prices. I think that'll probably be the one people are paying attention to, but yeah, we're going to have supply shortages and all kinds of different shortages that cascade out from this in ways that we can't predict. So yeah, I don't know what else to say. I think we're all kind of just watching this with at least every day I'm kind of glued to the headlines to see what's happening and how this is going to shake out. Not just from an economic perspective, but just this is a very major event in I think all of our lives in terms of political alignment and conflict and even just the thought of nuclear weapons and stuff like that, stuff we haven't had to think about. We've been in a long period of time where no one even had to think about the nuclear arsenal, really.
Yeah.
And now everyone's kind of thinking like, oh yeah.
Which I don't know what you think. I think it's incredibly unlikely, even if there was a conventional war between, I don't know, let's say NATO and Russia, that there would be any nukes launched. But on the podcast Angry Planet, which I've had Jason Fields on from that podcast before, and we talked about what would happen if something happened with TSMC, how that would affect supply chains. On a recent episode, they brought up on their podcast, or their guest did, an expert on Russian politics. It's not that we need to worry about like some Armageddon nuclear thing right away, but is it that inconceivable that if Russia felt threatened, they would launch a very, very, very tiny nuke at a remote power station, and it really wouldn't kill a lot of people, but they would do it to prove they're willing to use them? That's the type of thing I worry about.
Yeah, so there's been discussion about, where do so-called, in quotes, tactical nukes fit into all of this? These kind of low-yield, meant to supplement conventional warfare type weapons. I think something like that would be pretty effective at sending a message.
The message, are you so sure I won't ever use these?
Right. And I think it does totally change the calculus of warfare, because something like a tactical nuke has never been used, right? So not only are you, probably destroying some target of interest with it, but also saying, yep, these are the rules now. Like, and what does that say for Russia's potential adversaries? Does that give them the okay that, now tactical nukes and conventional warfare are okay? Like, it's a weird precedent.
Because it's an escalation if that happens.
Yeah, it's an escalation, and that's really what we all want to avoid, is escalation and lean towards diplomacy, of course. So.
Yeah, and that was, hearing that on the podcast Angry Planet, I keep plugging it, is that kind of like mental wall that I got through where I was like, yeah, but I don't think we're ever launching a bunch of nukes at each other. And it's like, no, but not right away. Kind of like if the evolution of it, the missing link in the evolution, if you will, is, oh, but that could be the first step. But I can never think of what a first step would be, and it's like, oh, we blew up this remote hydroelectric plant in the middle of nowhere. Only killed 10 people with this nuke, but guess what? We actually used a nuke now.
Yeah, and even with like World War II and the use of nuclear weapons was primarily to send a message. there's a lot of loss of innocent life in the meantime and things like that. And that was because we wanted that message to be heard loud and clear. So I think two things happen is like launching a nuke to send a message is one thing. Mm-hmm. Starting to use them tactically in a conventional warfare is another. I would hope if they were to use one, it would be solely to send a message. Because I can't imagine really a world where we're lobbing tactical nukes at each other all day in conventional warfare. It just sounds awful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'm guessing you'll agree with me. I don't think me and you could have imagined that a couple months ago, but it seems clear to me, I'll just say it, we're not dealing with the type of rationality we thought we were with the severity of this invasion. This isn't, we thought there was this 4D chess thing going on. I don't know, actually, anymore. I think we might have to maybe stop assuming everyone is as rational as we think they are.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that the nuclear option is such a big bargaining chip. Because, you could imagine a situation where Russia didn't inherit this huge Cold War arsenal of nukes. Maybe denuclearization took a different path and the number of warheads out there was far reduced and, mutually assured destruction wasn't a thing. How much of a bargaining chip would they have in conventional warfare? Almost none. Mm-hmm. If it's just a numbers game of NATO versus Russia. Mm-hmm. I think the West would have acted a lot sooner if it wasn't just for this one big bargaining chip.
Mm-hmm. But there's a reason the West is being more cautious with any further support, right, of Ukraine. Right. This seems to maybe be a much more real bargaining chip than we thought, because we thought the conflict wouldn't escalate this much. But clearly, whether it's a lack of rationality or the variables they're considering are not what we are.
Right.
We misjudged the situation and how bad it would probably get. I think we all knew it could be an option what's happened now, but I don't think we thought it was a plurality of the chance of what was going to happen.
Right. So had this been limited to a conventional conflict, I think the West would have been a lot more eager to move
between solely conventional powers. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it probably would have escalated to more direct confrontation by now. Mm-hmm. But yeah, just that nuclear option makes everybody hesitant. So I kind of understand why both sides are. Putin's kind of playing it to his advantage, right? He knows that his army probably isn't. It's no match for NATO.
And there's a lot of people that get mad at you listening to that, but I'm sorry. Like, from what we're seeing in the results so far, it's not.
I'm not saying it'd be an easy fight.
No.
Or one that anyone would want to fight.
No.
But if you look at just the United States military spending and development since the end of World War II, it's pretty much solely was focused on combating the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And Russia technologically.
And the spending didn't go down after the Cold War went away.
So you're talking about, these forces were, and NATO and its existence, its sole primary focus is to confront Russia in a situation like this. Mm-hmm. And now we're stuck kind of at the mercy of, we can't use any of those tools and all this spending because of the nuclear option. And so Putin's kind of having the in my opinion, he can abuse the effectiveness of his effectiveness of his conventional warfare is a little bit he's kind of getting away easy, that no one's confronting him because he's got the nuclear option in his back pocket.
Right. And because of that nuclear option in the back pocket, it's clear the West's plan is, if we just do overwhelming, like we've never seen sanctions constricting, you can't even play as the Russian team in FIFA, like that type of stuff, like that, at least it feels like we're in the conflict, even if we're not directly, and it makes the toll of this conflict, if it goes on for a while, feel like if Russia was fighting the West directly. Because frankly, it's almost like they are at this point. But I would say though on that note, then something I wanted to touch on too is I don't think it's going to be over in a month. I keep seeing these reporters like, hopefully this will be over in a month, and I'm like, guys, what? How many times do we need to see a conflict and go, we'll be back by Christmas? Like, we're not going to be back by Christmas once you start something. And even if something ended, like, I'll just say it, like the harshness of this invasion, Ukraine's not going to go, oh, we lost, well, we're friends again. No, this is going to be decades of resentment because of the harshness of this campaign on them. So this is something I think the entire world's going to be dealing with for a long time. And not to sound detached emotionally, but to try to bring it on subject to this, like how I see this going on for at least a year, massive disruptions to various, like, I mean, at the very least, the food production out of Ukraine is going to affect everything with that going down. How do you think this is going to sound real bad? How do you think this will affect prices, though, moving forward? Like, do you think we're seeing shortages improve? We're seeing prices falling down pretty consistently here every week. Do you think this is going to be bad enough to make them kind of stall where they're at soon? Or do you think it's because of how bad the shortages were before, just literally not enough stuff, that it's still going to get better in that aspect, even if like gas prices rise?
Yeah, that's a good one.
I know.
It's hard to imagine things getting a lot worse than where they were in terms of supply shortage. Because then, I mean, the whole world was kind of halted through COVID. I mean, you had literal production stops on not just, not just with chips and that whole supply chain, but everything, right? So everything got affected: cars, transportation, like just every aspect of human life. There was some kind of delay or shortage associated with it that we're still trying to recover from. So in that aspect, I don't think this conflict, forbid it gets way out of hand, it's just going to stop the world from continuing to produce as best as it can, find alternate suppliers, things like that. So this may be just kind of my own naive point of view. Maybe I don't understand the economics as well.
Well, I'm talking to you, so I'd love to hear what yours is.
Yeah, so unless this has the potential to make everything stop the way COVID did, I don't see it being worse.
Yeah,
so
from that perspective.
I'm at least hopeful that, prices are going to recover in some capacity. I think we're still going to have some shortages. We're still going to have some trickle down of the logistics of moving things around, especially with fuel prices affected. But it's not a whole hard stop the way COVID was.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like, I guess now that you put it that way, like if it's mostly about the gas prices, what's the graphics card that was priced ludicrously high for what people wanted it to cost, mostly because of the shipping? 6500 XT. Like, if you take what used to be $5 ship and make it $30, that makes a $170 card $200. So I think it's funny. I think next gen, we're more of this truncation of the high end will be as profitable to make again at like $1,000 as it was last gen. But again, $200 is just kicked. It's it's going to continue to be pretty bad, I think, in that realm.
Yeah, I guess I would say this. I'm hopeful that supply will get better. I don't know that pricing will be any different, right?
Well, that's a good point too. Those are two different things. We're seeing supply. Like, what do you want? We can go buy it on Newegg right now. It's just the pricing's not what we want it to be at.
Yeah. So that's kind of the vision, the future I'm seeing in my head, at least, is just like, you probably be able to go buy a card, but it's probably not going to be the price that
we were hoping
you would want or hope for.
QH Freddy writes in, he says, there's been a lot of noise lately regarding bringing manufacturing back to Western soil, but most of that has focused only on high-end semiconductor fabbing. What about less exciting stuff? Passive components, PCBs, assembly, or even more basic things like raw and processed materials needed for the manufacturing. How much can we really reduce our reliance on foreign economies? And I think this is a very good question and point he's touching on, because in talking to some of my contacts, putting together like the BOM cost per ampere, and then especially recently the RTX 3050 and 6500 XT, it's not the silicon guys, it's all of the heatsink manufacturers in China that just aren't in the US.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it really highlights how globalization is. Every decade it gets even more interconnected in ways that we never think about. COVID was kind of the big stress test on that, and we saw tons of industries kind of fall to their knees in terms of production, because we rely on so much from foreign produced materials and foreign assembly, and yeah, it's hard to say anything's made any one place anymore. And the United States, we still have good amount of chip fabs here, stuff like that. Intel still does a lot of fabbing here. Samsung, Texas Instruments. Plus, there's a lot of boutique fabs that do things that aren't high density logic. There's other fabs for like optical sensors and power transistors, FETs, things like that go into your power supplies. And so not all of it, not all the fabbing capacity has to be cutting edge, smallest transistors you can get away with. In some designs that's not even desirable. You want bigger transistors for their properties.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the United States is in a good spot to kind of realize what it can do to move more manufacturing here. It's not like our manufacturing base is non-existent.
Mm-hmm.
The real thing is what happens in the world if some kind of political or something happens that all of our shipments from Southeast Asia just cease.
If it was just an abrupt thing.
Mm-hmm. Then how good is the United States? What kind of position are they in
I'd say not good for at least a year.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with some of the more non-specialized goods. I would say, like just building like heat sinks and machined parts and stuff like that. We don't do it in the volume, say, that China does for kind of these commodity things that we need to put electronics together. Resistors, capacitors, just all that stuff. We don't push that out in volume. One big part of that is just the nature of capitalism. The work tends to go where the labor is cheap.
Mm-hmm.
Electronics manufacturing was really big, heavy in Japan, and then it moved to China. And I think even at some point, its days in China are numbered, and it's going to move to. I think it's even being explored.
Well, it's so automated now, right? That you almost wonder
of where's this going to go. India, Vietnam, Indonesia. There's already movements of certain manufacturing stuff even moving out of China to find ever cheaper labor and things like that. So part of it is labor, and part of it is also just what materials do you need. Asia is a huge continent. China is a huge supplier of rare earth metals and things like that. So as far as having all the stuff they need to support a manufacturing industry, that's very much to their advantage. So moving stuff back to the United States, I think, in a way that is usable volume is going to be hard.
Right. It sounds like it's kind of inevitable that a lot of it starts moving to the West now, and South America, all over, besides just Asia, Southeast Asia. But that if there was an abrupt cutoff to it, anytime in the next 5 years, we won't be done transitioning a lot of it.
And part of that is just going to be, should that kind of worst scenario happen where we're in some kind of conflict or otherwise we're cut off from those supply chains, the way we live our lives is going to have to be different anyway. Because all of that manufacturing capacity that we do have in the United States will probably get focused on military or other, essential needs before it ever goes back to consumer devices, if ever.
I think for a few years during World War II, in the U.S., you literally couldn't buy a new car. Like, they just didn't make them. It's like we're too busy making tanks and airplanes.
Yeah. So I would imagine something similar would happen where the manufacturing capacity that does exist, it's going to be busy not making consumer goods anyway.
Well, Timo H writes in, he says, regarding age-old things in geopolitics and manufacturing, is there any danger energy, material-heavy, and critical industries like silicon are in danger of running out of fuel, water, the raw material itself, cooling or other parts, either by prices being too volatile or some locations cutting off supply to other places due to political problems and changed priorities? I don't believe the U.S., for example, is in much danger right now, but the silicon industry itself seems very vulnerable, both from a supply chain complexity viewpoint and needing those raw materials or products supplied from only a very few places in the world. From watching American news, it seems like there's a lot of America first talk going on right now, but what does that mean to gamers, scientists, and others in Europe or Southeast Asia? Do these areas have enough political capital to ensure availability of those products for themselves? Which is something I think not enough people bring up, is like anytime America complains, Europe's like, double complaining about these issues.
So, I guess...
You already touched on a lot of that, I think.
But. Yeah, I think we already touched on a lot of that. As far...
like silicon itself, and like, I don't know if you have any idea of like the materials needed.
No. So I'm not aware, at least I don't track like who the suppliers are out there for wafers and stuff. The lithography process itself can be pretty complex in terms of the chemistry involved and what types of different chemicals and elements you need to source for it. I'm
looking it up. The biggest exporters of silicon for manufacturing chips is Russia and Brazil.
Okay.
So,
I mean, I would imagine we could spin those industries up if need be. But one thing to think about is I don't know how much of like rare earth metals is kind of one of the big ones.
And there's so many of them.
And what kind of exotic things do you need to build chips? So you'd have to get into the specifics of any process to really understand, what the high dollar limited items are. But especially with like RF engineering and communications stuff, rare earth metals, especially in like modems in your cell phone and stuff like that.
Yeah, when you say RF, you mean radio frequency for those listening.
Yeah, so RF or high frequency type stuff. Yeah, you need rare earth metals to make them as compact and as performant as the consumer expects them to be. So if you suddenly don't have access to those, it's like, well, can you even build, an iPhone anymore? You might have to actually just make some compromises on what products can even do. And so there's this thing that happens in technology, and I think it's that 80-20 rule again that I mentioned earlier. A good analogy is the energy sector and electric cars and even things like solar panels. It's like, yeah, this energy is free and it's cheap, and then it's like, yeah, we'll just push the efficiency a lot higher and higher, and then we'll totally rid our dependence on oil. But it's like, to push the efficiency of battery tech and to push the efficiency of solar cells to an extreme level usually requires exotic materials and exotic manufacturing, to the point where the benefits of it being cheap and plentiful and easy get eroded. Those then become very fragile things to produce. And we've kind of already done that to our society, where a lot of our consumer products are already fragile in terms of supply chain, and our expectations for them as products are already reliant on things that are short in supply and not easy to get. So if you were to restand up manufacturing, I think it would be a step back technologically in a lot of ways, because it's just, hey, we don't have this rare.
We literally don't have it. So we need to find a new way to make screens.
Either we find a new material that can do it, or or your product is 50% bigger because, I have to put 2 radios in it now because the one radio can't do both functions now.
All right, so I want to start winding down with some final reader mails here. This one's a little related to what we were just talking about. Clean Sweep writes in, and he says, "Hey, Tom and Matt, I'm interested in hearing more about the challenges of putting computer hardware in aerospace stuff like planes and satellites. I remember hearing somewhere, maybe even here on Broken Silicon actually, that a lot of the newer, smaller foundry nodes are vulnerable to the kinds of radiation that you find in outer space. Besides that, in the G-forces involved in going beyond supersonic speeds. What other things do aerospace engineers have to think about when incorporating computer hardware to be put in space?"
Okay, yeah, so that's a good question. Space is a fun place to work engineering projects, because it makes you think about a bunch of different stuff that you wouldn't on the ground. So specifically with computing power, one thing you really have to consider, especially in building satellite payloads or I'm sure even aircraft, is choose the computer that's right for the job. What I mean by that is you're not going to slap an i7 or Horizon into a satellite unless you need that throughput. So almost all the computers that are going in satellites and aircraft, they're very specifically chosen for how they perform. And it's kind of it's a less is more type thing is kind of the better way to go about it. You only want to put as much computing power in there as you need. And you only want it to consume as much power as you've budgeted for. And so a lot of the ways we think about computing of just like, oh, let's get the next best thing every time something new comes out. It's really not that way for space and aero. It's really about, does this thing fit a need? The utility argument is at the forefront. Literally, if it doesn't add enough utility, then we don't want it. So there really is no rush to put the next greatest, best CPU in a spacecraft unless the mission dictates that you need it or the mission fails type thing.
One thing I've read recently in a couple articles is that typically a lot of the computers put in spaceships, satellites, are based on lithography from several generations ago. Some of that's about the stability, the ease of use. Also, these projects take many years to be done. So it's like, whatever, that's what we designed 5 years ago. That's what they had. But I've also heard that there's something with just the reliability of the newer nodes long-term isn't there, that silicon at 5 nanometer, it's never really been an issue before when I troubleshoot PCs. It's like, I just assume the Intel or AMD processor hasn't broke. It's the motherboard or RAM or something, But I've heard that once we get to 5 nanometer, it's like, no, your phone's going to break in 3 years because the silicon is going to just wear out from the voltage usage.
Yeah, I think as just PC consumers and general electronics consumers, we've always kind of had it in our mind that we're going to reach obsolescence before we reach failure in terms of the silicon. I would be interested to see how that changes as we get to these smaller nodes. If it's something you have to think about, and we're sure throwing in a lot of things to think about when buying a computer. Yeah,
like you buy an RDNA 3 or maybe 4 nanometer, 3 nanometer RDNA 4 chip, and you're like, hey, I know this is $2,000, and it's like you see these people, oh, I'm going to keep it for 5 years. No, you're not. Not if you mine with it, because it's going to wear out in 1 year now. Unlike I've had 28 nanometer chips that just they could mine for another 10 years probably.
Right. But going back to the space thing, yeah, a lot of times lower or bigger featured transistors are desirable because they require more energy to switch states. And that's actually beneficial in space. So like when you're building a computer and you just want to do things as efficiently as possible, you don't want to spend a lot of energy getting a transistor to switch its state. But in space, where you're getting bombarded by radiation, you don't want stray radiation getting a transistor to switch its state. And one way to do that is if the transistor is bigger, it requires more energy. So so you get more radiation resiliency that way. They also go to great lengths to, do radiation shielding on the packaging to make sure that it can survive certain level of energetic particle bombardment. And they're probably also more vigorously tested in terms of like vibration and temperature stability and things like that. So it's going to depend on the mission, what chip you choose. A big word for a lot of the spacecraft and aerospace industry is legacy.
Mm-hmm.
Choosing parts that have flown in past missions and are proven, as opposed to new things that could go wrong. And it takes a long time to build a reliable, proven platform for the air or space.
Which, again, let's be clear about what reliable means here. We're not saying it lasts 5 years. We're saying this satellite that we're sending to Pluto lasts 50.
Yeah, I mean, look at how long Voyager's lasted. Some of these Mars rovers have far outlasted their useful mission time.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's hoping that the James Webb Telescope is going to be able to, one, have enough fuel to do its mission, but yeah, so longevity in space, it's like when you're spending so much money on a project, it has to work. You're not going to take a lot of risk on new technologies, and you're gonna put something new unless it really enables you to do something cool.
Mm-hmm.
And needed. I think that's what a lot of people miss about, like, oh, why doesn't the new Mars rover have a 4K camera on it and stuff like that? It's like, well, unless it's enabling something for science that's really important, it's literally just adding risk to the rest of the mission.
Well, and you can see this in military vehicles as well. You look at like the footage out of a attack helicopter and it looks horrible clarity, but it has thermal sights and it can see a dot. And that's actually all it needs to see to identify a target.
Yeah, and exactly. And, if the computer, as long as the computer has what it needs to track its target in terms of a targeting system, how well you can see it is not how well it's tracking.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's a disconnect. It's that whole utility thing of we're used to as consumers things looking prettier and shinier and high resolution. I mean, we waste so much computing power just so that your phone is showing you pretty notifications, and we spend so much computation power on just it looking pretty when the fundamentals of the computing that's going on underneath are actually pretty light in comparison to just, hey, it looks nice.
I mean, yeah, how many of the computational power is just pulling out a higher res image for an icon on a website when,
Yeah, and the text is like nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have one more reader mail here to wrap this up. Luke Mines writes in. He says, hello, Matt and Tom. What sort of career tracks are possible in the fields of working with FPGAs and PCB design? Sure, a lot. Because I have an interest here, and aside from requiring an electrical engineering degree, I'm not too sure what the career opportunities and working conditions would look like, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that at all.
Sure. So, electrical engineering degree definitely helps. As far as PCB design, you could get started today. You can go online. There are free CAD tools for doing PCB design. I know EagleCAD is one of them. There's another software called Circuit Studio you could look at that has a free version. But you could get started today. What's been kind of nice is with kind of the boom of the makerspace and things like that, is the amount of open source designs you can go look at and download has really, and the tools that are available for just hobbyists at home to do circuit design and build has really exploded. So there's no shortage of stuff that you can go access on the web, get a design for, and start practicing building PCBs today. So
I mean, I did some PCB design even as a mechanical engineer,
Yeah, I think it's probably something a good amount of engineers bump up into at some point, especially in electrical and mechanical engineering. There's not really, at least my experience going through school, it was never like, hey, take this track and you'll get really good at PCB design. There's definitely like a course here and there, But a lot of it's like any tool. Even getting good at something like Photoshop or whatever, you need to spend time with the tool. And employers are really going to care that you've spent time with the tool and you can do the certain things with the tool. So start getting experience with those tools. That's going to be a lot more valuable than just saying, hey, I took a course. It's like, no, look at these things I built. You know, so that's very valuable. As far as FPGA stuff, there are probably some FPGA boards that are within the price point for hobbyists to start playing with. There are definitely some other device. There's another class of devices called a CPLD, CMOS programmable logic device. It's kind of in a similar vein of an FPGA, but they're cheap enough that you could buy them and get started with like hardware descriptor languages and building little digital circuits on your own at home. You'd probably encounter one if you took a digital design class in an electrical engineering course. But as far as applying FPGAs, if you want to get into a field where they're used often, communications is a good thing to go into. So
what type of communications? Like, it's not like literally I got a degree in communications. That's a very
yeah. So I mean more like radios.
Yeah.
Building 5G or SATCOM or those kinds of things. Get into digital design and chip verification. Like design verification, digital design, you're most always going to run into FPGAs. Yeah, I'd say those would be if you do get into electrical engineering, that's where you'd want to probably focus.
Yeah, I mean, I can't give any advice on that there, but I knew you said you wanted to answer any questions that touch on that type of stuff if they came up. And
if you're a real masochist, you can go into RF design, and that's a whole other layer of PCB design that is really high sought after. And so that would be like building antenna structures and radios for things like iPhones and SATCOM, like phased array antennas. Starlink antenna is a good example of what an RF engineer would do. Like that stuff is there's a very big need in that market. But it's also very challenging. So you have to really
but is that one of those things where if you did that, it would apply to so many other things connected to it as well? They're like, well, he can do this, so he can work on this type of a circuit as well, for sure.
Yeah, you definitely will over time become more well-rounded. I kind of feel like in my career, I touched enough of anything to kind of know where to start on almost anything. Maybe I'm not super proficient at everything, but yeah, the hardest job to get is always your first. I feel like after that, getting your foot through the door is easier as you start to accumulate skills and accomplishments. So EE is a big field. Another benefit of it is if you get bored with what you're doing, it's so wide, you just hop on over to something else.
I mean, yeah, and that's one of those staple engineering degrees as well that applies to, it's like that, mechanical, and then probably industrial. It's like if you have one of those degrees, there's about a dozen things you can do, honestly, or even splice into other paths from it too. And I guess the only advice I'd add on to that is if you do go into electrical engineering with a assumption that you want to do this with that degree, don't be afraid if you find out you're better or like something else more that you can use that degree for, which happens to, I think, actually most engineers, to be honest, where it's like, oh, I got this degree to do this, but it turns out I actually like working on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I know a lot of people who have gone to school for one thing and totally pivoted to something else, or, even myself, you don't really know what's out there till you get immersed in it, and you don't know what you're going to like until you experience it. So yeah, have an open mind about what makes you happy and the things you're interested in. And I think as long as you're interested and immersed, you'll be happy. At least in employment in engineering, I've been pretty happy.
Well, I don't know if there's anything else you want to discuss. As I feared, we ended up talking for a very long time with the smorgasbord of subjects that I found we could touch on. And I think we touched on most, or if not all of them. I guess, you're an anonymous guest. Is there I have to ask, since you're on, man, is there anything you want to plug? Anything you want to tell? Could be anything.
No, actually, not really. I was mostly just here for engaging conversation, and I think we had that. So, yeah, I think I'm different from a lot of your guests, right? I don't come from specific industry or anything like that. So, I hope the audience found it entertaining, and yeah.
Well, I'm sure they did. But I guess then the only other thing to say is, as usual, thanks for listening. Subscribe to Broken Silicon on your podcast app of choice. Give us a review. Subscribe to the Moore's Laws YouTube channel. Ring the bell button. Tell your friends about us. Support us on Patreon if you can to ask us questions. Get ad-free versions of the shows. Get exclusive podcasts like Die Shrink. Talk with us, both the community and me, after content comes out on the Discord, and so much more. Can't do this without our patrons. And otherwise, stay safe out there, everybody. And thanks for listening.
This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, I don't do this alone. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother, Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, and special assistance by Carbon Cry. Find all of our information, including the information of sponsors you can support, at www.mooreslawsdead.com. If you would like to send fan mail or hardware to us, please mail parcels to Moore's Law is Dead at P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. And speaking of fans, patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content possible. The aging business model of spamming ads all over the content is dying. The future of media will be built on fans paying for the content they actually want to exist. And so if you have the extra money, but only if you do, please consider supporting us. For just $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to have your questions read aloud on Broken Silicon, Die Shrink, and Loose Ends, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord, full of like-minded people who would love to meet you and talk to you about computer hardware. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the entire back catalog of Flyover States podcasts and other projects Moore's Law is Dead has done, and thanks in the credits of videos and other perks as well. And hey, if you can't afford to support us, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family on social media, Reddit, and forums. And give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or your preferred podcast app. All of this really does help so much. And if you'd like to advertise on the podcast, hire Tom for consulting, or are a person of interest who would like to be a guest, please reach out to the email address mlhbdead@gmail.com. But as I said, this podcast would not be possible without its patrons supporting it, and so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher producer levels:
Brad Mellon, Anthony Greffa, Dale Russell, Jeremy Scalen, Loophole 35, Thomas Rupp, I Love You, Lynn and Jim, Ivan K, Tom Bailey, Muhammad Al-Kawari, Eric Osborne, Jeff Sedler, Andre Jacques, Sarcastro, Terrence Herod, Drita Full, Phil S, D31337 Antics, Jackson A. Miller, Jesse Jaskowiak, Josh Law, Brandon, Travis Gooding, The Mechanical Philosopher, Gaiman Since Reagan, Fatboy Desaru, Daniel Hyde, A Guy in PA, Nathan Mose, Coal Addict, Matt Salem, Aaron Close, F7GOS, Matthew Landavazu, My Name is Nobody, Judson N. Alethros, Jensen Wang, Hey There's a Kitty, Greg T. Wanchuk, Rentaro Matsuka, John Jameson, Sam Venzel, Matthew Lane, Mark Raidmaker, Jan Rauner, Chris Licata, Michael Medee, Meyer Tech Rants, Eric Jackson, Jonathan, Patrick Groh, 3DS Boy 08, Dominique Koch, Stefan, Original Ross, Sandy Garrido Saunderson, Joaquin Hagan, Teak Autumn, Sol Carner, Michael Casa, Delmaine Peterson, Z Jits, Aaron Keith, Gregory S. Acker, Hexapuma, Tom Sanfilippo, Justice Brennan, Zootsu Taylor, Trevor Powers, Stu, Elenia, Nanya, Daniel Nishbal, Franco Frederick, Dan Galanowski, Ian Clifford, Axel Cisneros, Leighton Perry, Joseph Kerriman, Brett Summers, Blake, Donovan Russell, Noah Nicolella, Zlicki, Martin Porshegi, David Cowden, Ricky Tan, Hulam, Patrick J.S., Justin Staples, Freddie Canoas Jr., Stephen Coates, Kiwi Phil, Brucha, Jeremy So, Mitchell Pell, Silvanos, Eddie Del Castillo, Jacob Laster, Luis Correa, Deek, Chris P. Erbakken, Tyler Lindley, Tim Robbins, Jake Dew 23, Brian Ringelman, Justin Gower, Caillou Markelli, Dave McCoy, Valco Malev, Gabe Lander, Ronnie, DNA Tech, Michael Deaton, MJB1, Maurice Courtois, Wesley Sager, Chrysantine, Mai Sharona, Y Trui, Roman, William W. Draper, ARS, Spamtum G. Spamtum, Henry Zhang, Stephen Hart, Christopher A. Butler, Greg, Peter Moore, Amy Will Chief, Justin Thomas, Sam Miller, Simi Malas, James Anderson, Shakir, Nick Rakin, Holden Mobley, Matthew Lazier, R. Pete Sharma, Meat and Pork, Jimmy NG, Maz, Matthew Lazier, Benjamin Oshley, Mark Mitchell, Shield TV, Couteau, Aaron, John Masink, Mohammed, Jean Debont, Pulse Media, Sean Ashmont, Daniel Dewar, Stefan Jang, JSMMH, Georgie Kostadinov, PC Beast 22, Reginald Airy, Narithiel, Ivan, Charles Russell, Hal Buma, Arkarsh Edithia, The Grid, Andrew S., Chris Rich, Powell Zagartowski, Desist, Zavbeat 03, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.